Thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to present the paper, A Framework for Geoeconomics. It's with my co-author, Christopher Clayton at Yale and Jesse Schrager, who's at Columbia. The paper is about how governments use their country's economic strength from existing financial and trade relationship to achieve geopolitical and economic goals. So a fundamental question is, is this even a thing? Like, is geoeconomic power effective? If it is, in which dimensions? But also, what are its origins? Where does it come from? And if you're a country that has this power, like say the US or maybe China, how do you wield it? In the colloquial version or in the financial press version of geoeconomics, very often one thinks of it as a zero-sum game, largely because if I have power over you, you don't over me. But I think here we want to ask a deeper question of, is it possible that it's negative sum or even positive sum? There might be positive aspects that come from these countries exerting power globally. And then, one of the most loaded questions is, which sectors are strategic? It's loaded because very often the word strategic gets abused in political circles to justify subsidies to some sector or some firm or another. But I think part of the abuse comes from not having a clear definition of what strategic means. And today we'll try to at least give you, our own definition of why and when a sector might be strategic. The framework we're going to introduce is pretty simple. It has three main ingredients. First, I'm going to have a collection of countries globally. Think of it as a global production network of capital, technology, some intermediate goods. And fundamentally, one of the problems is going to be limited enforceability of contracts. This is most obvious if you're thinking of, for example, a government-to-government relationship where you cannot go to court. But contracts are in general unenforceable in many parts of the world, or there might be things that we can't quite write down. And I'm going to allow for externalities on both the producer and the consumer side. The most typical example is external economies of scale. As one sector gets bigger, it gets also more productive. The conclusion of the paper is going to be that the hegemon is a global enforcer. So one of the things that it does is it makes sure that a set of rules and a set of contracts get followed globally. And the ability of exerting power is going to come from being able to link threats across different economic activities. Think of it as I might threaten you with suspending some official lending, but also suspending some access to, say, manufacturing inputs. It is a tenet of economics that in situations where there is limited commitment, these threats tend to create value for the entities that are being threatened because it tends to increase credibility. And so the hegemon here is going to request in return that the target entities take some costly actions. For example, the hegemon might ask trivially for some transfers. He wants some money back. But more to the point, he might ask them to distort economic activity in a particular way. For example, if I'm the US, I might ask European banks not to do business with Iran, or I might ask one of my firms not to export to China. Towards the end, I'll review two applications, one to national securities externalities, and another one more specific to China on official lending, like the Belt and Road Initiative. So let me sort of directly dig into the model. I'm going to have infinite horizon, and they're going to be n countries and a set of productive sectors and some local factors. Think of it as labor or local endowments. Here, a sector is a production activity in a particular country. So think of oil production in the US as one sector, and oil production in Saudi Arabia is another sector. The two, of course, might have an output that is a close substitute, but we're going to keep track of them separately. And then I'm going to think of a sector as having a unit mass of firms that produce using a differentiated good. So they get inputs Xij, and they use them to produce an output Yi that might be used by the consumer or by another sector as an intermediate input. And of course, they might also use a set of local factors to produce. Each country is going to have a very simple representative consumer. And the way I'm going to keep track of externalities is by keeping track of an aggregate vector Z of all quantities being produced in the economy. Since this is a repeated game, we're going to have a discount factor beta. So let me get into the consumer. That's sort of the simplest side of things. The consumer has a utility function over goods. think of Cn as a vector of all the goods that exist globally. And then you can see the first place where the externalities show up, we might allow them to affect directly the utility of the consumer. For example, I might not like a foreign military sector being big. The budget constraint to the consumer is pretty straightforward. On the left-hand side, you have usage, so consumption times prices. This is a vector of all goods he consumes. And then the wealth comes from owning the domestic firms. So pi is going to be the profits of the domestic firms. And then also owning the factors, so those are the factor payments. This is going to define a very simple Marshallian demand that tells me, given the prices and given wealth, what is optimal consumption for the consumer of country N. And the total indirect utility that the consumer of country N gets, at least from consumption, is the utility applied to this optimal Marshallian demand. So that's pretty straightforward. What is more interesting in the paper is the relationship between a sector and its suppliers. So here I'm going to describe it graphically. I'm going to think of a firm I that is in a sector I that places an order for an intermediate input. The order is Xij to suppliers in sector J. The suppliers can decide to accept or reject the order. If they accept it, we move one step forward, and the firm has two choices. It can go up the tree here and pay the suppliers, then it makes a payments Pj Xij, or it can steal from them. If it pays, so if we go up the tree, next period, the suppliers are going to still trust the firms in the sense that they're going to have beliefs that are consistent with the firm paying them in the next stage game. In that particular case, what is the payoff to the firm? It's up here. There is the per period payoff of the profits is going to make this period. And then there's a continuation value that comes from next period. The suppliers are still going to trust this firm. The economic profit for the suppliers, I'm going to call it zero in the sense that they could have sold to somebody else. Let's see what happens if instead the firm steals. Then the cost of stealing is that next period, the suppliers will have a belief that the firm is not going to pay. And that's going to mean that they're going to reject all the orders from this firm. So what is the payoff to the firm then? There is the same per period payoff, but now there is an increase that comes from having not paid for the goods that were delivered this period. And theta here, it's a fraction, is the fraction of the order that the firm can steal. This is totally exogenous, but think of theta as the enforceability of contracts. So if theta is zero, then the firm has no point in stealing because the suppliers can always recoup the money that they didn't get paid. If theta is 1, then there is no enforceability at all. The firm can steal the entire order, or at least there is no direct enforceability. The other cost, of course, is that next period, these suppliers are not going to trust the firm. And so the firm is not going to have access to that particular input anymore. From the supplier's perspective, of course, being stolen on is bad. They lose the value of the order, or at least the fraction that they can't recoup. So ultimately, what this does is that it creates a very simple incentive compatibility constraint for the firm. The only orders that the suppliers will accept are those that don't get steal on. And what is the firm trading off in deciding whether to steal or not is the short-run benefit, the one-off benefit of not getting paid versus the long-run loss of not having access to the supplier again. And so you can see that things like, is there an alternative supplier? Is there somebody else that they could go to that provides something quite similar? End up determining the right-hand side of that constraint. To what extent is it really bad if you cut me off? And that's going to be important. For now, we're going to take it as exogenous, and then we'll determine it in equilibrium in a second. So what is the problem the firm trying to solve is maximizing its stage game payoff, its profits, by using all these different inputs and taking into consideration the incentive constraints. Now you can see that the other place where the externalities enter is we're allowing what other firms and what other aggregate relationships are there in the economy to affect this firm productivity. As I said, one simple example is external economies of scale. Market clearing is pretty straightforward here. Consider a good that gets produced. It has essentially two uses. It can be used by the consumers to consume it, or it can be used as an intermediate input by other sectors. And the same has to be true for the local factors of production. Good. So now let me get into the where the paper comes alive, which are the threats. So far, I've essentially described what I'm going to call individual triggers. So if firm I doesn't pay sector J, then sector J next period is not going to accept orders from that firm. And similarly for sector K. If you think about that situation, the possible stealing decisions of the firms are described here. The firm could decide to steal from sector J, from sector K, or from both. And these three incentive compatibility constraints track essentially the compatibility of those decisions. Under what conditions the firm will decide not to steal from J, from K, or from both together. But now suppose that instead we switched the trigger strategies to be joint, in the sense that, for example, sector J is going not to trust again firm I, so accept orders from it, if either firm I steals from sector J or from sector K. And let's assume that this is symmetric, the same applies to sector K. Now all of a sudden we've reduced the problem to a single undominated strategy. So firm I will never steal in isolation from either J or K, given that both are going to retaliate. So the only thing that you can consider is to steal from both together. And so you can see that indeed we kept a single incentive constraints, the joint one. So here a joint threat is essentially collapsing the constraints together and bundling these options. We're going to think of a country like the US, a hegemon, as a country that can make these joint threats, whereas essentially the power that we're focusing on is the ability to use potentially very different economic activities and join them together in making the threats. So the first thing that I'm going to do is define the set of sort of firms and sectors, both in the rest of the world, that this country can make threats on. And in principle, we can make it quite arbitrary, but to make it like, the smallest possible intervention, we're going to allow the hegemon to contract with firms that are at most one step removed from its country. So think of it as, I can threaten a firm that is at most one step removed from me. This is not allowing for the threats to propagate to we're 50 steps removed from each other, but we're still threatening each other. We're making it a little bit more direct. Now, what can the hegemon do? It can make the joint threats that I just described. What it can ask in return are monetary transfers. So these are transfers that go directly to the hegemon representative consumer. Simplest interpretation is that these are truly monetary transfers, but you could think of them as, for example, also political concessions, anything that is expensive for the target to deliver that the hegemon would care about. And then we're going to think about a set of revenue neutral wedges. Think of those as import restrictions, for example. These are demands that the hegemon makes to the target to alter the shape of his economic activity. It might say, for example, I want you to not source inputs from a particular country. And that the whole contract, we're going to summarize it by gamma, which is the joint threat, the set of transfers, and the set of import restrictions or wedges that is going to demand. We're going to allow for local rejection of the contract. So if a firm I rejects the contracts, it reverts to the outside option. It doesn't get the joint threats, and it doesn't have to make the transfers and the wedges. But everybody else that has accepted the contract will stay the same. Now, think about what the value to the firm of these threats is. We go back to the problem of the firm. So now the firm is still choosing its imports its intermediate inputs and factors. It's taking into account, and now if it accepts the contracts, it has to pay transfers, and it gets affected by the wedges. And of course, it has the same continuation values as before. It is subject to the incentive constraints, but now the joint threats enter. The hegemon is now threatening an entire set of intermediate inputs to disappear together from the firm in the future if the firm deviates on the contract. The key is this participation constraint. So one of the key features of geoeconomics is that these countries are, like the US, are threatening firms that are potentially very distant from the country. They're foreign firms over which the country has no direct taxation power or legislative power. Think of the US making a demand of European banks that they change some activity that they do, like lending to Iran. Because of that, the demands have to be accepted voluntarily from the target entities. And the participation constraints tracks the maximum amount of demands that a country like the US, a hegemon, can make before the demands get rejected. They're too expensive for the targets to carry out. So this lack in the participation constraint, taking as given the entire equilibrium, is what I'm going to call micropower. Is essentially I'm threatening you, and to the extent that that one applies pressure to you, it would be expensive for you to lose these relationships, then I can ask you for something in return. And that's a concept of micropower we're going to use, and we'll discuss macropower in a few slides. In offering these terms, what is the hegemon trying to maximize? Well, first, it's trying to maximize domestic firms' profits and factor payments. But the second thing it's going to care directly about is going to care about transfers that it obtains from the foreign entities. And of course, this maximization is going to be subject to the participation constraints we just discussed. It should be obvious that transfers to the from the domestic firms are a wash from the perspective of wealth of the hegemon, in the sense that they come out of the domestic firms' profits, but those profits were going to go to the domestic consumer anyway. So that's why we only keep track of transfers coming from foreign entities. One sort of nice result of the paper is that here the hegemon wants to make all threats at his disposals. So it's going to apply the maximum level of pressure. In some sense, that's because we designed the paper for the threats to be cheap and credible to carry out. So here we don't have to think about which threats will the hegemon make and which ones he won't. In that sense, it's very different from, say, the threat to go to war that is extremely expensive to carry out ex post. Here the threats are commercial threats, and there is always an outside option for the hegemon. And so in equilibrium is going to want to make all of the threats at his disposal. To think about what the hegemon demands, we have to think about amplification. Why? So the way to think about this is, if the hegemon is going to ask a foreign firm to change an economic activity that it does, since it doesn't generally profit directly from the foreign firm, it's only going to care to the extent that the actions of that firm propagate through the network and have an impact on what the hegemon cares about. His own consumer, what the consumer cares about, or his own firms and their profits. It turns out to be possible in this paper to characterize the entire input-output amplification quite simply. In particular, think of any exogenous shock, like an exogenous variable moving E. Okay, in a second is going to be, for example, a foreign activity. What does that do to the entire vector of activity worldwide? Well, it's going to have a direct effect, and then that direct effect is going to propagate through a matrix. You can see it down here. That is essentially a Leontief inverse. For example, I ask foreign firm I not to import from J. As that activity changes, some other activity somewhere else in the world is also going to have to change, and so on. And what this matrix does is that it keeps track of the entire network amplification. Similarly, some of the amplification is going to occur because it moves aggregate prices. And again, that's a standard Leontief amplification. A price moves, everybody else will change their demand of inputs in response to that, and everybody else will respond to that too. And so this big expression down here keeps track of the price-based amplification through the network. Once the hegemon understands that these demands are going to propagate through the network, it's going to want to use them to shape the world equilibrium in its favor. So that's going to be, in our definition, exerting macro power, which I'm going to characterize in a second. So let's go back to the hegemon asking a foreign firm I to change its usage of input J. Why does he want to do it, and how much does he ask? Well, first, we're going to focus on this term, curly epsilon, as being the overall externality that the hegemon perceives from altering the activity ij. The more it's desirable to alter that activity, the more it's going to demand actions out of this firm or this sector. But then, of course, there is a countervailing force. You can see it down here. Etas are the Lagrange multipliers on the participation constraints, and lambdas are the Lagrange multipliers on the incentive constraint. It might turn out that I really want as an hegemon to affect activity ij, but I just don't have a lot of power. And so the Lagrange multipliers are very tight. And so I can't ask very much of you. If I ask more out of that entity, they're simply going to reject me. So here you're trading off the desired level of action versus the cost of asking each of these actions in terms of using up the amount of power you have over that activity. If we unplug a little bit more,
recording stopped.
If we unplug a little bit more what's inside each of these terms, you can see then the amplification. So first, that is, the hegemon might directly care about impacting activity ij. So that's a direct impact that that activity has on the hegemon's firms, on the hegemon's consumer utility. But more importantly, there is an indirect amplification. The hegemon might benefit because of the indirect consequences of that activity changing throughout the network. Think of it as, for example, I might not care so much about the lending the European banks do if I'm the US, but I care to the extent that that one is strengthening activities that I perceive as being hostile to me. For example, lending to Iran. And you can see that part of the amplification is going to be through quantities in the production function, and part of that is going to be through prices. That's going to lead to our definition of macro power. So I talked a little bit about micro power, which we said if you fix all prices and other activities is the extent to which you can demand actions out of the target entity. It's the slack in its participation constraint. But macro power is a little bit different. Is you might care about a sector and having power over it because it has a very large indirect influence on the overall global economy. What is interesting is that micro power is the private cost to the entities that you're trying to pressure of the actions you demand. And macro power is the social benefit to you as a hegemon of those actions. So here, the hegemon is trying to focus on strategic sectors as sectors where there's a large gap between the two. I can ask a lot out of the sector because the private costs they're going to perceive are relatively small, but the social benefits to me out of their actions are quite large. And so that provides a more precise definition of, in the context of this paper, what is a strategic sector. Let me return to something that I mentioned in the opening, which is to what extent is geoeconomic power a positive or a negative sum game? Formally, if you think of a planner that has exactly the same powers as the hegemons, so he has the same threats at his disposal and he can ask for the same costly actions, but cares about global welfare, how would that planner, that constrained planner do? Well, the hegemon in that planner will agree to exert all pressure they can. So maximal joint threats are positive sum because they expand the production frontier worldwide. However, transfers are negative sum, monetary transfers. Why? Because they tighten incentive constraints, and the hegemon is going to care about them because they go to his consumer. But from the perspective of a global planner, those are simply transfers from one country to another. Similarly, in terms of the externalities, the hegemon and the planner will perceive them differently. Quite trivially, if there are two countries that are hostile to each other, the hegemon is going to care about his side, whatever country is the closest ally or has the same perceived externalities, while the global planner will have to care about both in some weighted sense. And so here, this tells you that if you think of, for example, hegemonic stability theory, the hegemon is providing a form of public goods and correcting things globally, but in return is also extracting a lot of negative sum objects, in particular transfers. And so there's a bit of both the positive elements and negative elements that coexist in this equilibrium. Now, let me turn to the applications, and I'll do them relatively fast just to sketch them. And then, of course, there is more in the paper. They help in making the framework more concrete. One application that I'm going to use is national security externalities. So I'm going to specialize the model to have one country, the US, that has two sectors that are supplying something to firms in the rest of the world. Think of, for example, I being European firms. And then I'm going to think of a firm, Huawei in China, that is supplying information technology to these firms in the rest of the world. And I'm going to focus on two types of externalities. First, among the firms in the rest of the world, there's going to be a production externality from using this technology sold from China. Here, we're thinking about a typical thick market externality. If I know that everybody else is using this technology, it is more productive for me to use it too. So the more there is adoption, the more on the margin everybody wants to adopt the technology. And I'm going to assume that there is a direct national security externality from this technology being used, say, in Europe for the US. The US consumer or the representative government does not like that technology being used directly. So this is in the U or Z term. What happens in this setup? So I'm going to largely skip the setup and focus on a few equations. First, we can characterize the entire Leontief inverse that comes from the externalities in production of if anybody starts using this technology more, everybody else on the margin will want to also increase how much they use the technology, and this is going to propagate through the network. This is going to be important in studying how much the US wants to fight adoption of this technology. And here is the specialization of the tax formula I showed you before in general to this specific example. So the direct externality, it's simply the US, when approaching a firm in the rest of the world and telling them not to use this technology, directly cares about that firm not using it. So that's a direct benefit. But much more importantly, there is an indirect benefit that comes from the fact that once that firm doesn't use it, on the margin, other firms and governments that the US could never pressure will also want to decrease their usage of this technology. And this is going to feed on itself. So here you're demanding more and more action because of the indirect influence that you get out of those that you control. The last effect is on the participation constraint. This is sort of interesting. Why? Because it helps you, power here feeds on itself. As I convince the firm in my economic network not to use this technology, everybody else with amplification wants to use it less. But that means that the firms that I'm actually pressuring are not going to be nearly as upset or perceiving nearly as costly to concede to my demands if everybody else is also decreasing how much they use the technology. So here you can see that the indirect notion of macro power really plays a large role in shaping the demand and which sectors are strategic. I'll conclude very, very briefly with another example closer to sovereign lending. Here I'm thinking actually of China as the hegemon. So China is doing the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'm going to think of that initiative as being two things. It's making loans to firms in, say, a target country like an emerging markets, and is also supplying manufacturing goods. And part of the joint threat is if you ever deviate from what China is asking in return, both the loans and the manufacturing inputs will disappear at the same time. So it's joining them. Now, in this particular case, they're not going to ask for monetary transfers. They're actually going to ask for political concessions, like diplomatic concessions. So you can think of the T's, the transfers, as being the lobbying cost to get the political concessions to be made. One of the nice features here is, even if, for example, in this setup, there is no enforceability of the loans at all, because it's a sovereign-to-sovereign lending. The manufacturing activity that comes into the joint threat helps sustain the lending. You're not going to want to not repay the loan because you also lose the manufacturing surplus as you renege on the loan. And similarly, you might not want to expropriate the manufacturing activities because that also leads to losing the lending. So joining them together is going to make the activity more feasible. It also means that assessing the value that China gets out of each of these activities is more difficult because the value might get paid out in diplomatic concessions, in markups on the manufacturing or on the loans. But for example, you might see the loans being underpriced and underperforming, but overall that might generate a lot of value if it gets extremely valuable diplomatic concessions in returns. I'm going to conclude briefly by saying, look, in this paper, we try to present a framework to understand a big topic like geoeconomics and sort of make some definitions and some concepts more precise and start sketching what are overall the forces of how do you build the power, what do you ask in return, what is a positive sum, what is potentially negative sum. It's part of an overall agenda that we're designing where we're thinking about, okay, but how will countries respond to economic coercion? Does this generate, inefficient fragmentation? Here, for example, I had a single hegemon, but you could think of a world where there are multiple countries that are competing in being hegemons and offering something in returns for their demands. And then, of course, there's a very interesting question about measurement. You could imagine, and in the paper we sketch some of this, making functional assumptions like CES on the production function and starting to think about how would we measure if I threaten to disconnect these activities from you? How expensive is that threat for you? How much pressure can I exert on you? And in particular, thinking about also financial relationships. If I can kick you out from the dollar payment system, or I can kick you out from clearing dollar trades in the US, how expensive is that? And how much can I ask of you in return for these threats and applying pressure? So I think there's a lot more to do here, but hopefully you enjoyed this short presentation of the paper. Thank you.